Why do hoop earrings feel so 90s to me? This began with an incredible and comprehensive article by Christopher Penczak titled Generations in the Craft, which is where I'm getting this video title from. But I only learned about the article through Thorn Mooney when she made a video on 90s witchcraft. Then, after watching Thorn's video, YouTube recommended Cara and Emily Donnelly's videos on this same subject matter, and I said, yes, please. My own entry point into the witchcraft and pagan communities was also in the 90s, although I make a distinction between an entry point into the community of witches and pagans versus my entry point into the craft itself. Particularly back then, I think the dominant voice would be syncretic, or I think the term was eclectic Wicca. Specifically as an Asian American, I think I was experiencing some really interesting culture clashes. Little things like you would hear about certain color correspondences for candles that didn't always make sense to me. For example, associations with the color red. Animal symbolism didn't always make sense. Even how we talk about herbs and access to herbs was a really interesting culture clash. So, for example, my mom did not keep nutmeg or rosemary in her kitchen, but we had a never-ending supply of longyan, dragon's eyes, donggui, I think that's angelica root, rinsen, ginseng, star anise, cinnamon. Well, everybody has cinnamon. So while I see my entry point into the witchcraft or pagan community as being in the 90s, in terms of my entry point into the craft, I can't really pinpoint a date. It just feels like something that's always been with me since birth. And I know that's a controversial opinion, or there's a lot of different perspectives on that as well. I guess I'll just say that my perspective, and it's probably based a lot in my culture and heritage, is that people who take this path, it's an immutable characteristic, and I'm using the constitutional legal understanding of the concept of immutable characteristics. Yeah, I do see it that way. I do come from a world that views the craft as something innate, or the calling. I think this, no, the craft, no, sorry. The calling to the craft is something innate. It's like a tick or a neurological hardwiring. And there really is this belief that it's an immutable characteristic and you are called to it by the gods or a particular god or divinity of some sort. And the aspect of free choice or free will involved is you get to choose whether or not you want to answer that call. And then it's a matter of, some people cultivate a mastery over the craft and other people do not. But that part is just a matter of cultivation. The calling is innate. I think I should definitely point out that I'm using the term Asian witchcraft as a term of lazy convenience because there really is no ideological equivalent in most of the East Asian languages that I know. The dictionary definition of witch is usually u, but I think conceptually it doesn't always work. U really implies a spirit medium of some kind. U means you are communicating with spirits from beyond. Any type of spirit hierarchies, we can talk about that. There's very specific types of U, but you're definitely communicating with spirits, or you are journeying to spirit worlds, either or. There's a more shaman flavor to the word "oo" than there is like witch, spellcrafting, that kind of thing. So somebody who is described as a "oo" probably does divination, but if you are a professional diviner, like you professionally do that, then you would be a fortune teller, and we have all sorts of words for that as well. Even something so specific like astrology, you wouldn't say you're an astrologer because there are two very distinct types of astrology. And I put that in quotation marks because 八字, I know, you're supposed to pronounce it 八字. It's not really astrology, but it is. So if you do 八字, then you would say that. If you do 紫微斗数, you would say that. I think the translation of that is purple star astrology. But they're so specific. And so you would never just say, I do astrology. You would specify which of those two particular forms of astrological divination, natal divination, you do. If you're a Taoist priest or a priestess, you would just say so. And then they're not really a witch, they're a Taoist priestess. You're either a psychic or a medium, a spirit medium of some kind, or you do traditional Chinese medicine. So I think at a very fundamental level, there's a difference in how Eastern cultures philosophically view the craft and how, I guess, Western cultures philosophically view the craft. So that's why it's very hard to make direct equivalents. And a lot of the times we have to settle for lazy language. However, as much trouble as I find there is trying to connect the dots between Western concepts of witchcraft and trying to find an equivalence in the Eastern world, there's no such difficulty at all when you're trying to connect the dots between Western occultism and Eastern occultism. Just in terms of how I've been socialized to understand the words witch and occultist, witch seems to be more of an identification. It's a word of identity, whereas occultist feels like you're communicating something that you do. And I find that in both the Chinese language and the English language, this holds true. So the Chinese word I'm thinking of that I'm equating to occultist is 法师. A 法师 practices 法术. 法术 are practices. It is very clearly denoting some form of action, ritual, pursuit. It's active. And so over the decades, it's never really been this sense of being taught how to be a witch or being taught witchcraft. It was more being taught this specific form of divination, being taught this specific form of energy work, etc., etc. In other words, different forms of 法术. And then I guess at some point, the sum of the parts equals witchcraft. So I think a very big stumbling block for Asian Americans who are interested in witchcraft and are thinking, well, I really want to integrate more of my culture, history, and maybe historical forms of witchcraft from my ethnic background. The stumbling block that comes up often is just that of access. And I think it's because if you don't speak the language and you don't have foundational cultural knowledge in both the East and the West, then it's hard to find that connecting point because the concept of witchcraft is so different in these two different cultures. Another big barrier to traditional forms of Asian witchcraft to Asian Americans is that a lot of our parents look down on it. They see it as for the uneducated and for the poorer classes, because that was the sentiment toward those who practiced the craft in Asia. If you were Christian or more westernized, you were considered upper class, educated, and elite. And the closer to forms of folk magic you got, well, the more uneducated, poor, and low class you obviously are. Then, of course, at least in Chinese history, there was the Cultural Revolution where anyone who openly practiced forms of the occult were sent to re-education camps, or you had to wear these plaques around your neck that basically was a form of public ridicule, and then you were trotted down, the town square for everyone to mock you. Wicca versus witchcraft. Instead of talking about whether you can use Wicca and witchcraft interchangeably or how we ought to define these terms, that whole conversation I think is better led by people who know what they're talking about, and that's not me. I will only speak on how that conversation can sometimes feel irrationally and illogically, but feel as an Asian American. So I've been exposed to the concept of Wicca and have read Wiccan authors since the early 90s, and there was a lot about it that I loved and gravitated toward, but also a lot about it that often made me feel, justified or not, like I didn't belong and that I would be an outsider in that community. For most of that time, initially, I didn't see it as a systemic issue or a skin color issue. I just saw it as a me issue. I thought, oh, it's just me. I don't belong, so it's me who doesn't feel like I belong. And then fast forward to after the publication of the Tao of Craft, I was doing a lot of speaking engagements at various university campuses that were sponsored by Asian American associations. And a consistent recurring sentiment that was expressed over and over from campus to campus was, I've always been interested in witchcraft, but I thought Wicca was only for white people and therefore Asians can't be witches. Or to be Asian and Wiccan means you are whitewashed because Wicca fundamentally isn't for Asians. I learned from visiting campus to campus that this thing that I thought was a me thing was actually an Asian American diaspora thing. The decades of conflating Wicca with witchcraft here in the United States meant that when Asian Americans were exposed to Wicca and felt like it didn't belong to them because Wicca was white, the predictable, slippery logic leads them to believe witchcraft isn't for them. But when you separate out witchcraft and Wicca, the slippery logic gives way to minority voices realizing there's a space for them in this community, justified or not, rational or not. And it's probably not, no, it's not rational, but it is a truth. It was really incredible to get to meet college students, these attendees who were so happy, like genuinely over the moon thrilled to realize there's a form of the craft that was availed to them that they had access to that felt more like a place where they actually belonged because they felt like Wiccan spaces were spaces not meant for them. For sure, absolutely, it's factually wrong to think Wicca is for white people. But a really good question to ask is, why do so many non-white people feel that way? Something that I thought was a me problem turned out to be a lots of Asian American people problem. For example, it's really hard to find non-white Wiccan authors given positions of authority and treated as an expert voice. But the reverse is not true because when you think about, for example, expert voices, people given positions of authority in Taoist mysticism, in First Nations or Native American indigenous practices, you do find lots of white authors. And it's hard not to notice that when the going trend was to treat Wicca and witchcraft as synonymous, during that period of time, the witchcraft community was predominantly white, when the going trend is to not treat Wicca and witchcraft as synonymous. We start to get a lot more diversity because I think these people who often felt like outsiders now feel like they're given a space to talk about their practices. Because when you create an environment where you equate witchcraft and Wicca, anyone who doesn't resonate with Wicca feel like they don't belong in that conversation. And granted, there's the pros and cons, right? The positive is diversity, equity, and inclusion. The negative is if you've changed the scope of the definition of witchcraft to the point where we have serious conversations about whether the term is even meaningful anymore, then it just becomes very difficult because one word starts to cover way too many different types of groups of people. There's this exchange that happened at a talk I did on witchcraft that I just can't ever forget. I was talking about witchcraft and one of the attendees had made the comment, oh, so this is Asian Wicca. There's Celtic Wicca, Dianic Wicca, Garnerian, Alexandrian Wicca, and what you're talking about is Asian Wicca. To be honest, I think the real situation was that a lot of my own unresolved shadow issues bubbled up to the surface in that one little moment after hearing the comment. Even now, I'm trying to find the right words to describe what it feels like to hear that. And even today, in spite of how much the cultural consciousness has shifted and expanded, it really is only when you use the term traditional witchcraft or folk magic that you actually see authors who are people of color. And Penzak's article talks really astutely about the deepening divide between Wicca and witchcraft in the 2000s. And then by the time he gets to talking about witchcraft from around 2015 to present day, 2022, his discourse doesn't even include the word Wicca anymore. The word Wicca was used in every decade up until the 2010s. And after that, you'll notice the word Wicca doesn't come up at all. How interesting is that? But I think there's a really unwarranted backlash now. So you see this on Witch Talk, for example, where there really is an undeniable silencing of Wiccan voices, and that's not okay. I'm not saying I know much about Wicca, but I think I know enough to spot misinformation when I hear it. And there's just so much negative misinformation about Wicca on TikTok and Instagram as a way of denouncing it almost. And so there's this weird backlash that I think that's not okay either. Erasing it from history is not okay. So in terms of Asian American witchcraft, it's not really a thing. Instead, I would say because of certain opportunities I was presented with and me seizing those opportunities, for example, having a mom who was really into various forms of fa shu and like socializes with like. So because this was her own interest, her community of friends were all into these different types of practices as well. So among my aunties, among my mom's friends, I knew somebody who was a psychic. I knew somebody who was a medium. I knew somebody who did this, who did that, who had all the different forms of bazi, for example. My mom knew somebody who did that. And because I spoke Mandarin Chinese, I know a little bit of Taiwanese, not a lot. So I just happened to have a lot of opportunities exposed to me that granted me access to a lot of different forms of fa shu to establish a fairly strong foundational knowledge in forms of Taoist mysticism. That was then augmented by my own personal interest in looking up scholarly texts on Taoist mysticism. But growing up and as my interest in the occult intensified over the decades, I was reading Crowley, Israel Regardie, Eliphas Levi, Comte de Mallet, Agrippa's books, Key of Solomon, Arbital. So I'm also building up my foundational knowledge in Western occultism. I then personally, in this very unique as an individualized, syncretic way, made the practice of the craft Asian American by mixing it in with forms of Western occultism. But that was something that happened in a solitary, individualized way, unique to me. And I don't think that can be helped because at the end of the day, I'm Asian American. So if I were to practice some purest form of, again, Asian witchcraft, using that word just for a term of convenience, that's not authentic. The thing with witchcraft is it is a very unique signature. Every witch has a unique imprint, a unique signature style to their craft. And your craft, for it to be truly powerful at its best, optimized, is going to be in some way an extension of your true self. It's a sense of your identity amplified in a very empowered, spiritualized way. So for my witchcraft to be authentic, it needs to be Asian American and have this mixture of both Western occultism and Taoist mysticism. My mother's approach to forms of craft is going to be a more pure form of Taoist mysticism mixed in with Buddhism. Look at me, multitasking. So in terms of generations of the craft or the craft through the decades from a personal perspective, back in the 90s, I feel like in witchy pagan spaces, there really weren't a lot of Asian Americans, or at least in the specific bubbles that I found myself in, I was the token Asian. And what's so beautiful is now that's not the case anymore. There's a lot more Asian Americans, not a whole lot, but there's definitely more. In 2016, 2017, after the Tao of Craft, when I was going to different university campuses to talk about Taoist mysticism, I did find this revival of interest among Asian Americans in these forms of craft. Whereas I really believe had I done the same rounds in, say, I don't know, 1995, I would have been met with crickets. I don't think there would have been as many Asian Americans in attendance at events on Taoist mysticism back in 1995. All this time, and it didn't even occur to me, wait a minute, why not look in my old journals? Okay, so by the early 2000s, we're talking 2000, 2001, 2003, I was describing witchcraft, or my notes and studies in it, as transmutations of bodies, energies, and forces. Essentials, witchcraft essentials. Oh, what are the witchcraft essentials?
A white candle, a black candle, representations of the elements, clear crystal for energy purification, a mirror, tarot deck, runes, or I Ching, a small ritual pot that holds minimum 1 cup of liquid, and incense.
There you go, the essentials of witchcraft. Zeroth law of thermodynamics. I don't know how that's witchcraft. Maximum power principle, sentience, human society, and self-organizations. What? Okay, this is kind of witchy. A protection spell neutralizes the effects of hexes, curses, or negative vibrations others may be sending your way. What did 21-year-old me know about protection spells? Let's see. That was my early 20s. Now let's take a look at witchcraft in my late 20s. Charging objects as talismans. Okay, that's pretty witchy. I write in a lot of what would maybe be described as channeled language, nonsensical language. I don't even mind sharing. This is not secret to me anymore. I think this is nonsense. Like Agnya Nala Jala Jala Marut Vata Bhumi Bhuvana. And it goes on and on. Note to self, the next time you want to make fun of witches on TikTok, go read your own grimoire from 1999. Protecting the home against evil. The reason I think I'm smiling when I say that, because now you know I'm renting my own place now, right? You know, when you're much younger, before college, there's no conversation about needing to learn spells for protecting your own home, because it just didn't occur to you because you're living with your mom and dad, right? It was more about, I guess, love spells, right? When you are in your early teens, you're really interested in love spells. As you age out, you think love spells are crap. House, apartment, clearing, and blessing. See, yeah, now I'm definitely in my mid to late 20s. Lunar correspondences, solstices, and equinoxes, the Babylonian zodiac. Empowerment words. Wow, I wonder how long this took me to do. Fertility spells. Okay, now I'm in my late 20s. Tinctures. I don't even know what this is. It looks like some sort of attempt to explain magic through different levels of consciousnesses. Now we get to my 30s, but I think many of you have seen this before already. I do a flip through of this in one of my earlier videos. I'll try to remember to link the videos in the description box. A really interesting evolution is in that very first book or journal. I tried really hard to justify what I was doing through psychology or drawing equivalences to different physics formulas. Whereas by here, I'm just unabashedly woo-woo. I just don't care anymore. The evolution, it looks like this gets a lot more religious. This is unabashedly religious, whereas earlier on, I'm trying very hard to keep it secular, whatever that means. I really hope you will read Penzak's article and watch the videos linked below and share your thoughts. What did you think? And which decade was your entry point into the craft?